Hello everyone, I hope today finds you all well and healthy and being safe. That is of course the most important thing. What I want to talk about today is section 14 for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World, and this is the Punic Wars and Rome's expansion. We left off last time with Rome having taken control of the Italian peninsula by conquering its neighbors. And remember, the Romans had this rather clever new way of making war and doing war, which was to utilize their allies, their new conquests, as sources of troops. And what they would do is say, you can largely run your own affairs. We don't care what you really do with your internal affairs, as long as you provide us with troops on demand and basically let us manage your foreign policy and that sort of thing. And of course this meant that Rome benefited from having allies, and of course the term allies has to be put in quotes because the allies had been conquered by Rome, but they were Rome's erstwhile allies. And as long as this system worked, the Romans were able to generate, again, large numbers of troops very, very quickly. And that gave them a huge advantage in war because it meant they could literally wear down their enemy. So even if their enemy was better at battle than they were, even if their enemy generals were better than they were, the Romans could still push their way through. And this worked quite well as they conquered the Italian peninsula. But then the Romans were faced with a new challenge. And this challenge is going to be bigger than anything they had ever faced before, and that is the city of Carthage. Now, Carthage is located in North Africa, right where the modern country of Tunisia is in North Africa, and Carthage is one of these places that has absolutely the best location ever. The old saying in real estate that the most important thing about any real estate thing is location, location, location. Well, this certainly happens with Carthage, and with Carthage that meant that they had an ideal position for trade and mercantile success, and Carthage had gotten extremely wealthy. Now, the Carthaginians were descended from Phoenicians who had settled in this area. Remember, the Phoenicians came from what is today Lebanon, so the Carthaginians were a Semitic people, and they had settled here in North Africa, and they had done incredibly well. They had created their own very large empire in North Africa up into the Spanish Iberian Peninsula, and they were very, very wealthy and very, very powerful. And Rome is an up-and-coming power rising in Italy. Now, this is what happens when you have these situations. When you have two powers rising at the same time, sooner or later they're going to bump into each other. They're going to butt heads, because both the Romans and the Carthaginians were expansionist powers. They wanted to get more territory, more wealth, and more benefits and this sort of thing. And so this is what is going to happen. The Romans and the Carthaginians are going to run into each other. Now, there are three, historically, what we call the Punic Wars. The actual truth is, however, only the first two are really wars. The third one was a massacre, a slaughter, and a human rights violation of the worst kind, and that will come later. But the first two were major, major conflicts. And for the first time ever, the Romans were faced with an opponent that was going to be very hard for them to simply grind down. The Carthaginians were wealthy, they were powerful, they had the best navy by far in the entire Mediterranean. They were nobody to mess with, and the Romans, of course, are going to wind up messing with them. So these two powers are going to come to blows as Rome tries to expand its power outside of the Italian peninsula, and Carthage tries to continue expanding its power, especially again in the Iberian Peninsula and the islands of the Mediterranean. So this is what's going to happen. So the First Punic War erupts between Rome and Carthage, these two up-and-coming powers, and this is the problem that they both faced. The most dangerous kinds of wars that have ever happened actually are the ones where both sides are good at different things. And what this means is they're not necessarily going to fight each other directly. And what this means is that the war can go on for a very long time. Now, wars are always horrible, horrible things. Nobody should ever want to be in a war or to have anyone else be in a war. Wars are really awful things. The worst kinds of wars are the ones that drag on, that go on and on and on and on. And these sorts of wars tend to destroy not just countries, but often actual societies. If you want a good example, we've encountered one already in this course, the Peloponnesian War fought in Greece between Athens and Sparta. Remember, Athens was really good at naval warfare, Sparta was really good at land warfare, and so they went for 30 years back and forth and back and forth, and the result, well, they destroyed Greece. The two of them basically wrecked the entire Greek peninsula. And this, of course, led to all sorts of unhappiness and problems. So the problem that the Romans and Carthaginians face is the same thing. The Carthaginians are extremely good at naval warfare. Their ships are these battering-rammed ships, and they're very, very good at sailing them. And what they will do is they'll row up to you, they'll ram your ship, they'll put a hole in it, they'll back away, the water floods in, your ship sinks. They were incredibly good at this. Now, this kind of warfare requires high levels of skill. You've got to be really, really good in order to make this work. And the Carthaginians are really good at it. The Romans don't even have a navy when this all begins. What the Romans are good at is land warfare. They're good at putting a lot of troops on the field, and those troops are able to efficiently and effectively defeat their enemies. The Carthaginian army is not that good. And so what we find is the Carthaginians would want to fight this war on the sea, the Romans would prefer to fight it on the land. So when these two powers finally get into a fight, when they finally start getting into a war, well, what are they going to do? They're going to try and turn the war to their advantage. And when this starts, of course, who knows how it's going to go. But here's the thing about the Romans, and this is something we've got to understand about Rome, why Rome was so successful in many ways, was the Romans were brilliant at adapting. And this is an incredibly important thing. Remember, in sports, you have to follow the rules. So if you're going to play football, you're going to have to follow the rules. I could win the Super Bowl with a high school football team if my football team got to carry guns. But of course, that would break the rules, and so you can't do that in a football game. But in war, one of the ugly, horrible things about war is there really are no rules. And that means wars get nasty, they get brutal, they get awful. All right? And this is what's going to happen here. The Romans realize we cannot beat the Carthaginians in traditional naval warfare, but if we're going to win this war, we have to defeat their navy. So what do? They adapt. They change the rules. And here's what they did. They got their ships, they built a whole bunch of ships very quickly, and then they equipped their ships with hooks. So instead of ramming the enemy's ship and then backing away and letting the hole in the side of the ship make the ship sink, which is the classical way, the Carthaginians were very good at that, what the Romans did is they put hooks on their ships. They put a bunch of marines, a bunch of soldiers on their ships, and what they would do is ram a Carthaginian ship and then tie themselves to it. They'll hook themselves to it, send over the troops. Those troops would slaughter the Carthaginian crew. And this is what the Romans got good at doing. So the first battle the two of them fight at sea surprised everyone. Shock, shock, shock. The Romans actually win. The new rules actually worked. So the Romans said, hey, this is great. This war will be over fast. We can just send our troops down to Carthage and destroy them, and we'll win, and it'll all be wonderful, and everything will be just fine. Unfortunately, the Romans didn't realize that the Carthaginians understood the same rule. You've got to adapt. So the Carthaginians had brought over professionals to train their troops. And so the Carthaginian army goes out, and when the Romans land and they try to attack Carthage, the Carthaginians defeat the Roman army. So now what we have is this weird situation where the Romans have won the battle where the Carthaginians should have won, and the Carthaginians have won the battle where the Romans should have won, and the whole thing devolves into basically a long and miserable stalemate, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And this was a very, very awful war. The First Punic War was a truly horrible Punic War. It lasted from 264 to 241 BC. Now, the Carthaginian leader in all this is a fellow named Hamilcar. He gets himself a star. Hamilcar is an extremely clever guy. He's an extremely clever guy. And so this war goes on and on and on, and finally the Romans manage to get the upper hand, but it's a tough fight. It's a very tough fight, and the Romans get the upper hand, and they technically win the war. And they get the island of Sicily for their trouble. All right? They get the island of Sicily, and the war comes to an end. But do you think this is going to make sure there's no future wars? Of course not, because neither side was decisively defeated. The Carthaginians are still around, and they're still powerful. And they know there's going to be another war. They know they're going to get into it with the Romans again. And so what do the Carthaginians do? They start preparing. And old Hamilcar says, we've got to prepare for the next war. There's going to be another war with Rome. We've got to prepare. Now, Hamilcar had two sons. One is a fellow named Hannibal. The other is a fellow named Hasdrubal. Hannibal gets a star because Hannibal is going to be very, very famous. And here's what Hamilcar did. He raised his two sons specifically and strictly to fight Rome. That was their life. That was all they were ever really going to do. And the way he did this is he hired himself a Spartan. Remember, the Spartans by this point are kind of sad. They're sort of pathetic old guys sitting around talking about how tough and great they used to be before they got themselves stomped by the Thebans. We remember how that all occurred. Well, the Spartans are still around being macho, being tough, but nobody cares about them. They're small, they don't really matter, but they still have an incredibly strong military tradition. So our good friend Hamilcar hires a Spartan, brings him home, and says, you're going to tutor my sons in war. Now you can just imagine if you're little Hannibal or little Hasdrubal, and you're sitting there, and in comes Dad, and he's got this really big, scary-looking guy with him, and he says, hi kids, this is your new tutor, he's going to teach you. Well, if it happened to me, I would have a heart attack on the spot, and I'd be dead, and that would be very, very bad. But Hannibal and Hasdrubal actually did very, very well. All right, they actually learned from this Spartan. And there's something else we have to understand. As it turns out, Hannibal is a military genius. This guy is one of the most brilliant military minds of all time. He had an intuitive, like Mozart level with music. This is an intuitive level understanding of war. And about the only other person, I think, in ancient history who can really claim to be as good at this as our friend Hannibal was, would be Alexander the Great. And this is always a fun thing to do. I was having a dinner with my old ancient history professor from the University of New Mexico, and we were talking, and I put the question to him. I said, if you had equal armies, equally good armies, and you put Alexander the Great in charge of one army and Hannibal in charge of the other, who would you bet on? Who do you think would win? And oh my, did he squirm. Because this is a tough question. He finally said, I think it would be Alexander. Because Alexander never really lost. Drank himself to death, sure, but never really lost. Hannibal would lose one battle, only one, all right? But here's the thing. Alexander never had to face the Romans. Hannibal did. And so I said I would flip a coin. They're both that good. As we're going to see, Hannibal is going to do things to the Romans that are just awful. He's going to wreck them something fierce, and he's going to be the greatest challenge they are ever going to have to face. So Hannibal is a military genius, and so Hamilcar starts putting together an army, he starts getting his troops ready, and of course then his sons inherit. And sure enough, it doesn't take long before eventually the Romans and the Carthaginians are going to go at it again. They're going to fight again. And of course what they're fighting about is going to be Spain. They had made an agreement that everything north of the line would be Roman and everything south would be Carthaginians, and it sounds like good détente, except there was a city in that south of that line, a city south of that line that said, no, we're going to go with Rome, and Carthage said, no, you're on our side of the line, you've got to go with us. And the Romans said, no, it's our city, you have to do what we say. And so this launches the next war. Now Hannibal, being a genius, had realized something. He'd learned a lesson from the First Punic War. And his idea was this: the reason we lost this war, the reason we had this problem, was because, dagnabbit, we didn't fight the Romans on their turf. The old saying, the best defense is a good offense, this is what he's talking about. He's saying, hey, what we need to do is take the fight to Rome. We need to go into Italy and wreck Rome there. Now, the other thing Hannibal did, like Alexander, Hannibal was smart. He did his homework. It amazes me how many leaders and generals don't do their homework before they launch crazy things like wars or other sorts of campaigns. They don't study their opponent. They don't study the circumstances. They don't study the situation. And so they just stumble in blindly, thinking it'll all somehow work out. That is a sign of a very bad general, a very bad leader. A good leader studies the situation beforehand, understands what's going on, how things work, and how best to make it work to his advantage. And so Hannibal had studied the Romans. He'd studied the Romans very carefully, and he realized their big advantage is there's unlimited numbers of troops. The Romans can keep raising new armies. How do they do that? Well, they do it because of their system of alliances. It's not that Rome itself has bigger armies than anybody else. It's that Rome, with its allies, has bigger armies than anybody else. So he said, here's what we need to do. We need to break up Rome's system of alliances. We need to shatter the system of alliances, then Rome will be one city, we can defeat them in battle, and yea, hooray, hurrah, we'll win. And that was basically his strategy. And you know what? It was the right strategy. I cannot possibly think of a better one to deal with Rome at this time. There's no way you're going to outdo Rome any other way. So Hannibal says, we've got to take the fight to Rome. We've got to take the fight to Italy. And that means we got to land ourselves a big army in Italy. And this is what he sets out to do. So when the war starts, the war is kicked off, the very first thing Hannibal does is he takes a whole bunch of his professional, highly trained troops, and he marches them north from Spain up over the Alps and into Italy. Now, the Romans knew he was doing this. You can't hide an army this size moving, and they tried to send a force to stop him, but they arrived too late. And that force would land in Spain, and that force and the Spanish Romans are going to be fighting with Hasdrubal, who's going to be fighting over in Spain. And that's the side of the Second Punic War we never hear much about. So Hannibal gets his troops into Italy. But before he gets there, he runs into one other thing, and that's the Celts. Now, the Celts really hated the Romans. They truly hated the Romans. And these are big, scary, wild kinds of guys, and they don't like the Romans at all. So Hannibal shows up, and he says, hey, guys, how'd you like to kill some Romans? And what do you think the Celts said? Sure, sounds good to me. I'll get my buddies together and we'll join up with your army. So Hannibal reinforces his army with a huge bunch of Celts. Now, Hannibal's a ruthless guy. He didn't tell the Celts what he was going to use them for. I had a student many years ago who actually came up with the best term for it. Now, there is a term, we call it cannon fodder. It's an old term in history, and it's basically you get some guys to run at a cannon, the cannon shoots them and blows them up, and then the cannon has to reload. And this, of course, is the way that the cannon fodder idea works. Well, my student came up with a very clever term, and I just have to give my student credit for this, and it was called meat shields. And what Hannibal does is he uses the Celts as meat shields. He uses them as a way to absorb the sizable number of Romans who attack and keep his good troops fresh in the battle. And this is what he's going to do. So he launches his attack and he marches into Rome, and yea, hooray, hurrah. Now the Romans, they see him coming and they say, we got to stop him. And they send out an army. Remember, the Romans loved war. They wanted to get those big victory parades. Yay, hurrah, for the great guy to win the battle. And so these Romans march up with an army, and what happens? Hannibal absolutely annihilates them, just destroys them. Because he's a genius. He knows what he's doing. So that's really bad. So the Romans go, oh no, that's not a good thing at all. So then they said, I guess we better send up another army. And they do. They get another guy in charge, and he wants to be glorious. He wants the victory parade, and he marches up, runs into Hannibal. What happens? Hannibal totally annihilates him too. Now this is a bad situation. Now things are really bad because Hannibal starts marching around Italy. He's marching around Italy, and what is he doing? He's breaking up the system of alliances. He's making life miserable for all of Rome's friends. All right? He makes life miserable for all of Rome's friends. And what does this mean? This means that the Romans are going to have to figure some other way to stop him. And now they've got themselves a serious problem. I also have a problem that my battery is running out, so I'm going to stop here and pick up this lecture in just a moment here.